Hello, everyone. I am back after a long break, and welcome to this recitation. Today, we're going to be going over a React project where we're going to make a xylophone. Now, this project isn't meant to be your first React project. It's probably better suited to be your second, third, or fourth. I will make videos covering some of the earlier topics here, but um, one of the most important steps in your React learning isn't necessarily your first exposure to it, where you become familiar with the component model and the syntax of JSX, but how you can actually use those to make things, which usually means mapping over data to create a series of components dynamically, and interacting with those with events, and maybe, if we have time, using state to make our applications more interactive and valuable. So what we have here is our completed project, the xylophone. We'll end up with something that looks somewhat like this. We won't necessarily make it exact, but we can play it. If any of you recognize that song, please let me know. I tried very hard to learn how to play it. As you can see, I have no idea how music works. This is not I was considering making this an actual music thing, but I didn't want to learn how that worked. So how are we going to do this? I have a project set up for us. It's going to be linked in the description. And we have some starter files in here. One of the first things you should do whenever you approach a project is to take a look at everything you have. Our main file is going to be in the source directory, and app.js. That's where the bulk of our React applications are going to live. This is going to be the first place where things start to happen. Let's take a look at our goals here. So our goal is to create a working xylophone like we saw. An important thing is I want all of these bars to be a component. I want to abstract what it means to be one of these buttons that plays a musical note, and then I want to use it over and over again. Another thing that's important is I do not want us to hard code all of these buttons in here. That's certainly something we can do, but oftentimes, let's just say almost always, hard coding things is going to make our program less resilient to changes and less useful in general, because it's going to be a lot of work for us to improve it and make things better and fix bugs if I have code repeated in a bunch of places. So we want to find the right level of abstraction. And one of the goals when we're writing React applications is to take units of work that we have, like these buttons that all do the same thing, and create a component that can represent each of them in turn. We also don't have to figure out how to play sounds all on our own. Inside of this assets folder are a bunch of WAV files that contain our notes. I do not know what the numbers next to them mean. They were like that when I downloaded them. We have this file notes.js, which imports all of them. Interestingly enough, you can import more than just JavaScript files in a React project. You can import pictures, you can import audio files, you can import a whole bunch of things, and React will take care of packaging them up in your application when it's time to send it out into the world. And this file is going to contain this array of objects. It's called notes, and each object has two properties. Name, which is the name of our note, which we're going to use to render this text right here, and the audio file, which is one of the files that we've imported from up here. And they're in the correct order, so we don't have to worry about that. And we have in our app.js notes already imported. So now that we have the lay of the land, let's get to work trying to create our application. We'll go away from this pretty one, and we're going to take a look at what we have to start. So what we have here is our React xylophone, and we have all of our buttons. And so far, they don't do anything. They're just hard-coded in there. We're going to replace them, but one step at a time. So the first thing that I want to happen in this project, right, the core of the Xylophone project is that when I click on these buttons, something happens. And so let's talk about events for a minute. When we write vanilla JavaScript, we make use of event listeners. And so I would have some element, and then I would add an event listener, and then it would accept a callback function that would take an event as an argument maybe, and we would, say something like console log clicked. And we would specify the type of event that this would fire on. I think that's the first argument. I don't write a lot of these anymore. And that's how we would write an event listener with our vanilla JavaScript working with the DOM. In React, we use a different method. We make use of props. Whenever we want to configure our components, we use this attribute style syntax. So this div, which contains our application, accepts an attribute called class name. And so when we look at our application in the DOM, we see that the div has a class of page. Now this is called class name instead of class, like we're familiar with in normal HTML for historical reasons. Class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript because we can make classes, right? That's a special character. So we have to call it class name. But the whole point of React is that we extend this syntax in order to make it do more complicated and interesting things. So instead of having to track all of these buttons and add event listeners to them, I can say on click and then specify the callback function that I want to use. So normally when I'd make my event listener, I would put my callback function here, right? I would say on my DOM element, I want to add an event listener for a click event, and then this would be my callback. I can say for this button, I want to add an event listener on click. It's going to take an event as an argument, and then we're going to console.log clicked. So now we can see when I click on this C button, we now see clicked show up here. And I can click on it again, and this will repeat itself. Now, where does this crazy syntax come from? Well, it comes from web standards. So we also have this syntax available to us in normal HTML. Instead of specifying an event listener with our add event listener syntax, you can literally go on any node in your DOM and say on click and specify what happens in here. Right? So when we click on this button, we do something. Here, when we click on this button or this image, it's going to pop up an alert that says hi. An important thing here is the fact that I've given this a function. One of the most common mistakes you're going to make when working with event listeners in React is not giving the right thing to onClick. For example, if you wanted to make this button console log clicked when you click on it, you might, rightfully so, think you can do this. All right, I have my button. On click, I want a console log clicked. But let's see what happens. Immediately, I see the word clicked in my console before I've even touched the button. And the reason that this has happened is because let's investigate what is going on between our set of curly braces. In JSX, whenever we want to write some JavaScript, we have to open a set of curly braces, and then we specify our JavaScript. And what I've done here is I've said console log clicked. And this, right, it might seem correct, right? This is what I want to happen on click. But let's investigate what this line of code is actually doing. If I take it out of here and paste it down at the bottom of my file and say console log clicked, what does this line of code do? Well, it literally will print the word clicked, right? That is what a console log does. However, what does this line of code do? This defines a function that when run, it will console log clicked. And this is what we want to do when we specify event handlers. I don't want to give it a line of code that will run and do something immediately. I want to give it a line of code that when it is executed, when some condition is met and the computer decides that it needs to run this, that we execute our callback, our event handler, our function. Right? When we use event handlers, when we use onClicks, we always want to give them functions. So when we click on this button, we will console log clicked. And there we go. All right, so with that out of the way, let's make these buttons play music. So we have our notes from Notes.js, and let's take a look at that in another window. We have these two things. We have the name and we have the file. And luckily, I've included this nice text so you don't actually have to figure out how this works. If we want to play sound files in React or JavaScript in general, we use this syntax, new audio, the path to the file, which we have here, and then .play. And what this will do is this will create an audio class, which is actually just an audio DOM element, and then we can play it at will. So let's do this on our button. Instead of console logging clicked, what I want to do is I want to create a new audio class out of the first note in my array, right? So notes is an array, and the first value we're going to get with our square bracket syntax at the index of 0. So we're going to have this object here, and then I want to get its file. And now that I have my audio object, I can ask it to play itself. And there we go. We have music. Incredible, right? With just a little bit, you can start doing some pretty neat and interactive things. However, what I don't want to do is copy and paste this here. I don't want to start doing this. Right? As soon as I start doing this, I lose the ability to make fast changes to my code, because now, instead of having one place where I can change things, I now have to do it in many places. So for example, one, I've just introduced a bug, right? C will play the C, D plays D, E also plays D, because I messed up copy and pasting. And you will find, as you copy and paste code, you'll do this very frequently. So whenever we find ourselves doing the same thing over and over again, that should be a cue to us as developers that we should reach for an abstraction. We should try to write a function that does this thing, or write a component that does this thing. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to write a component, and we're going to keep this all in the same file. The convention is, with React, that we write one component per file, and there's no real reason we need to do that. You can write as many components per file as we want to. Some people are very dogmatic about it, but it's important for you to realize that we can do whatever we want. Two, when we're starting with React, it can make a lot of sense to, even if you later move them into their own files, write your components in the same file, because you're going to add a lot of cognitive overhead in trying to understand how things work when you're flipping back and forth between files. And really, if you just kept them right next to each other, you might just take a little bit of mental burden off and allow yourself to actually solve your problems instead of fighting with your editor or with your short-term memory. So I'm going to make a new component here, and we're going to call this note button. And it's just going to be a function. It's going to return some JSX, and we're going to return a button element. And that seems good so far. So what do we want a note button to do? Well, I want it to accept one of these note objects, and then I want it to display its name, and when it's clicked, I want it to play its note. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have our component accept props as an argument. And then before I do anything else, I am going to console log props, and I'm going to put a little tag in front of it that says props. You can give as many arguments to console log as you want, and we can use this to display a string before the variable we're printing, and oftentimes that helps keeps it straight instead of just seeing random things pile up in your console logs. Props are another thing that trips up a lot of new developers when they're coming into React, and experienced developers as well. Props are kind of a non-obvious thing to a lot of us. So I'm going to render a note button, which I do by using the name of my component inside of my JSX. And we're going to see what happens. Props is an empty object, right? Props is an empty object. If I add anything here, let's say something, and then we give it a value, let's say the string 1, we see that our object now contains the key something and the string 1. Right? We see the key something and the string 1. If I change this to key name and this to value, we see that we have a key name and we have a value. Right? This syntax gives people a lot of trouble, but I want you, before you get frustrated with yourself, with your program, with not understanding how it works, whenever you're up against this, instead of just trying to change things until something works, right? We all know we get into this panicky mode of frustration where you understand maybe 40% of a problem, right? You know what you want to do. I want my note button to take this thing as props, but it won't work, and it keeps giving me an error that something is undefined. And so you just keep changing names, trying to guess the configuration that is correct. And instead of doing that, I want you to take a second and try to prove to yourself what you know. So for example, if I give my note button this arbitrary prop, key name and value, and I console log props, what happens is I change the name, right? If we change the name of the key, the name of the key inside of the props object changes. And if we change the value, the right-hand side changes. All we're doing is we're following this basic syntax, right? Prop name is equal to prop value, right? Left-hand side is the name, right-hand side is the value. This is the same as variables, right? Our variable name is equal to our variable value. This is the same as objects, right? Our key name is colon equal to our key value, or I guess our object value, whatever you want to call it. Left-hand side is the name, right-hand side is the value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my note button a prop, and I'm going to call it note. And what its value is going to be is inside of the set of curly braces, because I want to do some JavaScript here, I'm going to give it the first note in our array. So now when we see our props object console logged, we see we have a key note, and its value is this object from our notes file. It's our name, and then our file, which is crazy because React is doing its magic in order to include it in our final build of React so we can host it wherever we want. And so this is what it's going to be when our website actually ships out. So now that I have these, I can render the name of my note button by saying props.note, right? That's going to give me this object. We have our props here. Then we're accessing the note key. And then I want to get the name out of the note. So we have props.note.name. And now as we can see, we have two C buttons. But the one on the right-hand side, right, this one will play the audio file when you click on it. This one won't. So let's just steal what we've written here. Let's just take this onClick event handler, and let's toss it onto our button. So on click, I want to create a new audio class. Instead of giving it this notes of 0 hard-coded, I want this to be props.note.file, right? Whatever note we're getting via props, whatever note we're giving our component here, this note, I want to create that, and then I want to play it on click. So now, I can click my button and it works. And I can get rid of this hard-coded one here. Now, the next step might be, right, we can now copy this and paste this. And now this is notes of 1. And now we have our D button working as well. All right, and this is an improvement. I have much less stuff going on here. And so if I want to make a change, I can do that in one place, and it'll now apply in multiple places. Like, for example, maybe we realize this is actually a bit of a, a performance issue potentially. If we're creating this audio element on click, I might want to actually move this out here and say, audio is equal to, oh, I deleted some things on accident. Right, const audio is equal to this, and I'll create it here, and then I'll just play it inside of this callback. It doesn't really matter what we want to do, but if I make that change, it now applies to all of the buttons that I've rendered. Still, this is not great, right? Hard coding in these indices are not great, because I could very easily, for example, continue on in this sequence and do, 2, 3, 4, and then maybe I go too far, and I do, let's just make sure I'm wrong, 10. There aren't 10 of these, right? There we go. Now we've hit an error, and that's because notes at index 10 doesn't exist, right? Props.note is undefined. We see when we start rendering these things, right, that this one is undefined. So instead, I want to make use of some tricks we know from JavaScript to create these components on the fly. I want to create them dynamically. Right? When we use these curly braces inside of React, what we're doing is we're saying, I want to use a JavaScript expression. Right? I want to do some JavaScript that is going to evaluate to something. That's what an expression is. An expression is anything that you can type into your JavaScript editor or command line or whatever that is going to turn into a value. So 1 plus 1 is an expression that evaluates to 2. Console.log of 2. It's not really an expression, right? Because it just turns into undefined. Yes, it prints 2, but it's not really an expression. It doesn't give us back a value that we can then use. What is explicitly really not an expression are things like if statements, right? If, true, then I want to console.log true, right? This is not an expression, and I've missed an extra set of quotation marks here. This is not an expression, right? It's a control structure. The if statement allows us to control what kind of code runs, but if I ask you what value is an if statement, that doesn't really make any sense. In the same way that, right, if I tried to assign the result of this if statement into a variable, right, this would not make any sense whatsoever. So this is not an expression. Expressions are things that we want to put inside of variables. And that's what we do when we open up these curly braces in React, is we're supposed to put code in here that will turn into some value. Notes of 0 will turn into this object, which then becomes the prompt. What I want to do in this set of curly braces is to write some code that will turn into a bunch of note buttons. And we can do that by using our map function, right? My very favorite of all of the array functions in JavaScript is the dot map. The idea behind the dot map is we use it on an array of notes, and then we say for each value in this array, right? For our array of notes, I want to take one and I want to do something with it. And whatever I decide to return in this function is put inside of an output array. So we're mapping the array from one value to another. So let's see, I can take my array of notes, which are just objects, and I can say I want to take one note, and then with this arrow syntax that I really love, right? I'm taking this note and I'm turning it into something else. Let's turn it into its name. Now we see all of the names of our notes, because what React is doing is it's seeing the result of this expression, seeing the result of this set of curly braces, and it's getting back an array of pieces of text, all of the names. And so React is kind enough to place them directly into our document. We can do this with JSX as well. We don't have to return just strings. I could instead decide to return a note button. Right? And this is going to make React mad because note button expects a prop. What prop does it expect? Well, it expects a note, and so let's give it the note that we're getting from our map. And now you can see we've got all of our note buttons, and I can remove these hard-coded ones here. Because what I'm doing is I'm taking this array of note objects, right, the name in the file, and I'm turning them into an array of note buttons, our JSX, our component. And for each one of them, I'm giving it a prop called note, and the value that is coincidentally called note, right? If you're confused here, I want you to prove to yourself what is happening here. If I change these, what happens, right? If I change this to something else, I've console logged my props, what happens to the prop? The name changes, right? The key, props dot something else is now what happens. We've decided to name everything note because it's somewhat easier that way to keep track of, but we could easily call this note object, right? To make it a bit more clear to ourselves. So now we've got all of these, and look, we've gone from a bunch of hard-coded lines to this one very small line here. This is the power of abstraction. This is the power of the component model. And so now I can click on any of these. And there we go. We have a functional xylophone. We're done. Not quite. I want to go a little bit further. So we have all of our note buttons, right? Everything is perfect in the world, except for this warning that we're getting in our console. Now this is a warning. It's not an error. Our React application will continue to work, even if we never address this, but we probably should. What React is telling us is that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. And this is important to make good React applications that are performant. Because what we lose out on from hard coding everything to going into this dynamic creation of JSX components is the ability for React to know what's what. It always knows that this note button is going to be rendered right here, right? It knows that. It's never going to change. But this array of notes, React can't know ahead of time how many notes there's going to be. It can't know if those notes are going to change. And so what React has to do whenever notes change is it has to rerun this whole map, and it has to create all of the note buttons again. And if you don't give React key props, what React is going to assume is that they're all different now. And so it's going to delete all of these buttons off of our web page and then put in a bunch of new ones. And if we do this lots and lots and lots of times, it's going to slow down our application. However, we can tell React that these buttons actually are the same over time. And some of them may change, right? but we can give each one of them a unique identity. So React can know in between processing these that it's the same note button. It doesn't have to delete the old one. It can just change the name, right? React doesn't have to do all this extra work. And it does this with a prop called key. And the value of key can be literally anything, but it needs two properties, right? One is clearly stated here. Each one should be unique. React needs some way to distinguish each button from each other one so that it can tell which ones are the same and which ones have changed in between renders, right? If notes change and we add one to the end or one to the beginning, React can then know it just needs to shift all the other ones forward or back. It doesn't have to delete everything and start over. So they have to be unique, and they also need to be consistent. I've seen a lot of people do something like this. Boom. These are all unique, right? These are all going to be processed at slightly different times, and so now all the key values are different. Or, even more horrifying to me, boom, we're all unique. Except one, there is a possibility that some are the same, right? Random numbers don't mean unique numbers. You can flip a coin and get heads twice in a row. Two, these aren't consistent. If your key values are changing constantly between every time you run your React application, then you've gained nothing, right? So what we want to do is we want to have unique values that are going to stay the same over time. Usually what that means is it's very simple. We've gotten some data from an API. We want to render our list of users or Pokemon cards or GitHub profiles. All of those are going to have an ID because they're from a database. We use the ID as the key. Easy as that, right? We're done. We don't have those here, but each of these notes has a unique name, so we can make use of that. So I'm going to put note.name here, and now we have a unique key value that's going to stay the same in between runs of our React application. Now our warning goes away, and I can delete all of these, and we have our buttons. And that is fundamentally it for us to have this working xylophone, right? Not very much code when you look at it, but it's pretty neat, right? So where do we go from here, right? There's a lot of things we can do. If we look in the README, we've checked off our set of primary goals: create a working xylophone, we play the notes, use a reusable component for each one of our note buttons, and don't manually create each note. Let's create them with a map. All right. We have a lot of stretch goals here. Use state to keep track of notes as they're played so that we can replay them. Let's do that real fast. And then we'll do some styling. I think styling is going to be a lot of fun. There's some interesting things we can do there. So far our application is devoid of state. And what I mean by that is there's nothing distinguishing our application after our user has interacted with it than from before they've interacted with it, right? Nothing changes. Yes, when we click on this, some audio plays, but if we wait for that to stop, there's no indication that that's ever happened, right? Our application is stateless. What state allows us to do is it allows us to keep track of things that change over time. So I'm going to import from React a function called useState. And what this allows us to do is this allows us to take our React component and let it keep track of things over time. And I'll go deeper dive into how state works later, but what we generally do is we make a call to our useState function here, and then on the left-hand side, I'm going to get two values. I'm going to get some stateful variable, and then some function to set the value of this variable. Now I don't want to call these state, I want to use this something more descriptive, so let's call this played notes, and let's call this set played notes. And this is the syntax we use for interacting with state in React. Now, when we call our useState function, we can specify as an argument the initial value that we want to have. I want this to be an array, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put, every time we click on a note, I'm going to put that note object in this array so we can keep track of them as they've been played. Right? And I can do this by making use of my setPlayedNotes function. That's going to allow me to change the value of played notes. So let's pass this down as a prop to note button, right? So I'm going to clean this up just a little bit. And then I'm going to add another prop. Remember, left-hand side is the name, right-hand side is the value. So I'm going to say setPlayedNotes, and then its value is going to be our setPlayedNotes function. And now we're going to see another prop in our object. SetPlayedNotes, and its value is called dispatchAction, and it's a function. Right? The important part is it's that function. And what we can do here is we can call this function to change the value of played notes. So right now it's an empty array, right? I'm just going to add this to our document by making use of a cool trick. JSON.stringify will take any JavaScript data that you give it and turn it into a string. React doesn't like displaying objects, because what does that really mean? What does an object look like on a website? So what we can do is we can just turn played notes into a string using this function, and React knows exactly what to do with a string. So right now it's an empty object. What I want to do is I want to change what happens when we click on our note buttons. When we click on a note button, what I want to do, in addition to playing this note, is I wanted to add it to our list of played notes. So I'm going to change the syntax here. So far I've been using what we call an implicit return with these arrow functions. So I take my list of arguments here, and this is the value that this returns. And I'm only allowed to put one thing in here, but if I wrap this in curly braces, now I can write a normal function body where I can do multiple things. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the value of played notes to be an array containing the note that belongs to this component. Oops, I missed the word props here. All right, props.setPlayedNotes is that function. And now we can see when I click on my note, our value for our value for played notes now contains this note object, right, for C. And if I click on D, well, now it contains this one, but I've lost out on the other one, right? Because what I'm doing very explicitly is I'm setting the value of played notes, right? I'm setting this value to be our note inside of an array. What I really want to do is I want to add this to the end of the array, right? I want to add this to the end of the array. And so what I can do is I can add another prop to our note button, right? And I can say played notes is going to be equal to played notes, right? And now that I have this, I can come up and instead of setting it equal to this array with props.node on the end, I can add it to the end. Now normally you might think that we would do this with something like props.playedNotes.push props.note, right? Push is the array function that adds something to the end of the array. We don't like doing that in React, because what that does is that mutates values, right? What that does is that changes the value of the array. And it's an important distinction here between what this dot push does and what set played notes does. Because what this dot push does is it takes the array that we give it and it adds another element onto the end of it. Right? It changes the value that was to the value that now has this note on the end. And React doesn't like that, because the whole idea of React is that no matter what this value is, we display it on this page, right, in this manner. And when this value changes, well, we're going to display a different version. And the way that React does that is actually pretty simple. How do we manage updating this value, right, this played notes value, whenever this changes? Well, we would need some complex code to listen, to check and see if this changes and then react to that and figure out, how we needed to change things. Instead, what React does is whenever you call this setPlayedNotes function, right, whenever you call this function and change the value of played notes, what React does is it runs the app function again. It reruns our component. Because in this new version of the component, in this new version that we've ran, played notes now has a new value. So we just calculate this again. And incidentally, we calculate everything else, which is why these key values are important. But React takes that output, right, the new version that we asked React to create with the new value for played notes, and it compares it against the old one. It figures out what the differences are, and then it efficiently devises the number of updates it needs to make to what is actually on the screen to get it to represent the new world, right? And that's what makes React fast and efficient. You'll hear terms like virtual DOM and diffing and DOM manipulation and update, all this stuff. What React does is it runs this function again. It just gets the output and it figures out what changed. And we don't have to worry about things that were, how things used to be, how changes actually happen, because we never mutate values. I never actually decide to change what things were in the past. I get to say what they will be like in the future. And we'll explore that more in some different projects. But for now, I'm absolutely not going to do this, because React will not know that this has happened. And we can even do this here. Instead of setPlayedNotes, let's do this push. Let's see what happens. It appears nothing's happened, right? This is still this empty array. But if I add here a console.log props.playedNotes, we can see I'm actually adding elements to this array. React just doesn't know it's changing, right? React has no way of knowing it's changing. I need to use this setPlayedNotes function in order to tell React that, hey, I want to change the value of played notes. You got to calculate everything again that relies on it. So the way we're going to do this is, instead of using .push, is we're going to come into our setPlayedNotes function and we're going to give it a new array that contains our old array, played notes, with props.note added onto the end. Sorry, props.playedNotes. And I do this by using the spread operator. What the spread operator does is it just takes off our outer set of brackets. Right, so I'm going to really quickly pull up a terminal. And I'm going to open up Node, and we're going to see what we mean. I have an array. R. It's 1. Actually, I'm not even going to use a variable here. I have an array. 1, 2, 3. I want to add a 4 to the end of it. Well, I'm going to do that by typing inside of a new array, dot, 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 1, 2, 3, and then a 4. And we see what happens is 1, 2, 3, 4. Because what this triple dot does, what this spread operator does, is it just deletes those square brackets for us. We can use it on objects too. New object, dot, 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 A is 1, here, B is 2. We get an object where we just came in and deleted those curly braces. And that's how the spread operator works. All right, that's it. That's all we got. Okay. So that allows us to add something to the end of our array in a way that React likes, and in a way that when we click on this, we're now able to see these changes as they happen. So let's do some fun things. Let's get this looking pretty. Alright, so what I have done here is normally when you run create React app, when you're sitting in front of your basic project, you'll have in your app file import app.css. And that's a CSS file. You can put whatever styles you want in there. I've gone ahead and I've added node SASS as a dependency and instead imported app.scss. And that's going to let me use SASS, which if you've never used before, don't worry. It's very similar to CSS. You can write normal CSS in this file and it'll happen, but it's going to let us use some neat tricks that make writing CSS a lot more fun. So first, let's get these buttons looking like buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another prop to our button. This is going to be class name, and we're going to call it note-button. Then I'm going to add in here a class selector, note button, and let's just make some changes. So first, padding, I'm going to do just 10 pixels all around. Let's give it a height of 200 pixels. No border. Border none. Color is going to be white. Font weight is going to be bold. Background color, let's make them green. Border radius, I'm just going to give them curved edges. Let's set that to 5 pixels. And let's see where we're at. There we go, that's looking better. Let's set their width to be 40 pixels. Let's put that up next to height. Let's set the font size to 24 pixels. Alright, that's looking better. And then let's also say we want some spacing in between them. So let's do margin right of 15 pixels. Alright, so now they're spaced out a little bit. Make them a little bit fatter. 60 pixels, there we go. So now what I want to do is I want to make use of a CSS pseudo selector. And what a pseudo selector lets me do is it lets me access some property of my element that isn't representable by, you know, a class name or an ID or something like that. My favorite one, the one that I use all the time, is called hover. And the way we specify pseudo selectors is we take our normal selector and then we add a colon and then we access whatever fake property this is. In this case, I'm asking CSS to style my note button when I'm hovering over it. So what I can do is I can take this background color and I can make it slightly darker. And so that's going to be, I don't know what it's going to be. We're going to find out, because the Firefox DevTools have this neat thing where when I click on a color here, I can actually just find a new one that I like. There we go. That seems good. Not too dark. Then I'll paste that in here. Alright, so now when I hover over them, it changes. That's a little bit light. Let's make it somewhat more noticeable. That's good. Alright, as I hover over these, now we see we get this nice color change effect. Now also, those of you might be intimidated by the idea of creating animations. CSS makes it super easy. All I'm going to do is I'm going to set this prop called transition. Its value is going to be a time, in this case 0.3 seconds. Now, when any property of Note button tries to change, our CSS is just going to make it occur over 0.3 seconds. Why 0.3 seconds? Well, most things look really good taking 0.3 seconds. It's just the magic number. So now when I hover over this, we see that this change just takes a little bit of time, right? Just a little bit of time. It's very subtle, but makes our application look a lot more responsive. I'm also going to do this little trick, cursor pointer. Now when I hover over a note button, I get my little click pointer, which is very good. I kind of hate it when I see buttons that don't give me that pointer, because it's like, you want me to click on this, right? Why aren't you letting me know that I'm supposed to click on this? So, cursor colon pointer. Now we're going to do something really weird. And that's going to be making use of what's called a CSS pseudo element. Or first, actually, let's do one more pseudo selector. So this is normal CSS styling, right? Having these two selectors out here, but I'm using SASS, which is a CSS precompiler. And what I can do is I can, inside of my note button selector, I can make use of this ampersand character. And what the ampersand literally means is whatever my outer selector is. And I can write this instead. Right? These are literally equivalent. Ampersand will become note button. And so this will be note button colon hover. So I don't have to rewrite it all. So now I have my hover effect. I'm going to make use of one more, which is pretty cool. So we have, right, all of these have a little right margin. Oftentimes when we're styling this list of things, we want the spacing in between them. That's great, but I don't want the spacing on the last one. Here it doesn't matter too much, but we'll use another pseudo selector to make things cool. And that's going to be last child. What this represents is the note button that is the last one in its container. And for that one, I don't want any margin right. No margin for that one. So now we'll see this button actually has no right margin, right? There's no little yellow spacer. We can go a step further and make use of the not pseudo selector, which will say, you know what, actually, for every note button that isn't the last child, I want to give it margin right. So now we've achieved the same effect, but we've written slightly less CSS. Nope. We've written slightly less CSS. And this is actually the preferred style, if you can. You can avoid an unnecessary cascade of setting margin right twice. In this case, we just say everything but the last child. Guess that margin right. Just a little bit cleaner. I'm going to change my indentation real fast. Should be at 2, not 4. 4 is for crazy people. Okay. Now I want to change the height of all of these, right? In a good xylophone, these get smaller as they go on. There's a lot of ways we can do this. There's not a lot of ways. There's 2 ways we can do this. One is to make use of SASS mixins to kind of automate setting the styles for all of the different notes. The other is to use dynamic inline styles. Do you have a preference on what you'd like to see?
I'll take a look at inline styles. I haven't used them as much as I use mixes.
Okay, great. Um, I love SASS very, very much, but one of the problems with using it or CSS or less within your React project is it can be difficult to interact with it from JavaScript. So what I want is for these heights to get smaller over time, right? The later we are in this list, I want them to get smaller. But how do I represent that in my SASS? That's difficult. I want to use math. I want to do stuff in JavaScript to tell me what these height values are. And there's other solutions to this. Styled components is a big one. But React has this built-in notion of style. I can set a prop directly on here the same way I would on a DOM element, right? Where I could say style background yellow, right? I can set a style prop here. I can do the same thing in React. So I can say style is equal to, I need a set of curly braces because I'm about to do some JavaScript. We don't do this in strings. Then I need another set of curly braces because I'm about to use an object. And we specify CSS properties as keys in this object and their values, the values associated with those keys. The only difference being when we have something like font dash weight, right? I cannot have a key in JavaScript called font dash weight. This becomes font capital W weight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the height property to be 200 pixels. And we're going to see nothing's going to change. What if I make it 300 pixels? Now they've all gotten a little bit higher. This is going to take priority over whatever styles I have in here because you'll see we're literally setting these inline, right? This carries through to what actually happens on the DOM. But I want to use some math. I want to use some math to do this. I want every time we go down to reduce their height by, let's say, 15 pixels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another prop to note button. And this is going to be its order in this list. And what I can do is I can make use of my map again, because map is a wonderful function and map should be your friend. The first argument to our callback within map is always going to be one element from our array, right? We have notes, plural. We get a note, singular. There's a second argument that we can take, and that is going to be the index in the array. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm going to go ahead and give this index to note button. And this might need a better name than index, right? This right-hand value is an index, but maybe a better name in the context of it being a note button. It's something to do with music that I don't understand that would actually dictate this height. But I don't know that. So we're going to keep calling it index. And now what I'm going to do inside of my note button is I'm going to do some math with it. And I'm going to say height is equal to 200 minus 15 times the value of our props.index. Right, the first one is going to be 0, so our first height is going to be 200. And then I can't forget, our height value needs to be in pixels. So I'm going to add the string px to that. And boom, there we go. Now we have our successively smaller tiles, buttons. I don't know what they're called. All right. going to do at least one more fun thing real fast, which is getting these white dots here. They're absolutely my favorite part of this xylophone is these little white dots. And how do we do this? Right, you might be thinking to yourself, there's a couple ways to do this, right? These could be images that we're putting in here. These could be little divs, right? I could add some divs here. And then I could give these some styles. Class name is circle, right? And we could make them look like little circles, which let's do that right now, actually. Okay. So we're now just putting in some fictitious divs here. And then we're going to give them some style. So a circle is going to be, its background is going to be white. Its width is going to be 20 pixels. Its height is going to be 20 pixels. Its border radius, if we run it to be a circle, then we can set that to be 50%. It's going to be 50% of its width. So that is going to be, I actually don't know if it's width or height. Well, it's going to be like that. Let's make these a little bit smaller. There we go. Now we have our little circles. I want to position them correctly. So what I'm going to do, right, note button is our parent. So I can set display flex on it. That's going to mess everything up because now they're columns. I'm going to set the flex direction. I'm sorry, rows. I'm going to set the flex direction to be a column. I'm going to align those items, which is our off axis, right? Our main axis is vertical. Align items will describe our off axis. I'm going to center them. And then I'm going to say justify content space around. And now they're all spaced out. I've kind of ruined our nice flow because now these are block elements. I'm going to fix it real fast by making use of this container div, which has the class Xylophone. I'm going to make that display flex. Gets us all in a row again. And I'm going to need an align items of center to center those along our off axis. And there we go. Those are our little divs. Except this is wrong, right? I don't like this because I have these useless divs here, right? These absolutely useless divs. If I look in my HTML, it's horrible. It's messy. I have these circles. If we're worried about accessibility, I would have to make sure to tag those with like ARIA hidden so that screen readers weren't like, here's some divs. Instead, what I wish I could do was just in CSS say, hey, I need just like some extra things here. Well, luck has it that you can do that. It's called a CSS pseudo element. We have these selectors before and after. And what you might think these do, and you wouldn't be out of your mind to assume that they work kind of like last child, right? Last child will give us the note button that is the last one. So before and after, what those should give us is, from our current note button, the one that comes before it or the one that comes after it, right? Wrong. That's not what they do. Instead, what they do is they select an element that is before or after the child of, in this case, our button. That's C, right? The text inside of this button. And it will select an element before and after this. In this case, these are our divs. This div circle and this div circle. Except those elements don't exist. They're called a CSS pseudo element. And it allows us to select an element that doesn't actually exist in our DOM, but still apply styles to it. So let's see this in action. What I can do is I'll just do this on the before. So I'm going to set a special property called content. Its value is a string. It now says before here. And if we look inside of our inspector, we'll see that we now have this fake element, this double colon before, that is our CSS pseudo element. Now, if we want to use these, we need to make sure the content property is always set. If content is not set, then it won't show up anymore. So oftentimes when we use this for styling, what we do is we just set content to be this empty string. So now what I can do is I can actually take this circle style and I can drop it into my before and after and then set content to be an empty string. And there we go. And now I can get rid of my gross extra divs that are just making my HTML super ugly. And there we go. Now we have our little white marks. All right. Cool. Is there anything else that we would like to see? Let's see. We got state. We got some CSS going. You know what? Let's do the replay real fast, and let's talk about how I like to write callback functions. So far we haven't done anything egregiously bad, but let's get this replay thing working. And you know what? Let's get clear working for that matter. So clear is easy. What I want to do is I want another event handler. I want to listen. Whenever this button is clicked, what I want it to do is I want it to set played notes to be an empty array. Now we can clear it quite easily. Boom. Right, done. Well, I also want to replay all of these notes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say on click, and this is going to be equal to set played notes, and then I want to play all of them, right? So I'm going to do map. I'm going to take the note, I'm going to get the note, I'm going to create the new audio class of the note.file, then I'm going to play it. And this is going to work perfectly, no problems at all. All right, so we've played a couple notes. Then I'm going to click, you know what, let's play a couple more. And these are getting really delayed, and I believe it's actually because of this console log. Because we're not really doing things super efficient here. There we go. And now I'm going to replay this. Oh. This should not be set played notes dot map. That's the wrong error. Played notes. Alright. Okay, now we're going to play them. And of course, they all play at once. So really what I want to do is I want to delay the playing of each subsequent note by some amount of time. I can make use of my index value again. And what I can do is I can actually wrap this inside of a set timeout. And I can delay them, you know, by a second per each one of the index, or a half a second or something like that. But what we've noticed, right, is this function is starting to grow out of control. It's getting too big for this line. I could wrap this inside of a set of curly braces, right? And I could, you know, keep writing it slightly more legibly. But I don't really like doing that because we've made it slightly more legible, yes, but it doesn't really become all that more readable. One of the points of abstraction that we achieved in creating this note button component is not only collecting all of this functionality and reusing it, but also the name. Right? The idea that this has a name, that it is a note button, it tells me at a glance what I expect this to do. And names are very, very powerful because none of you write comments in your code. Not a single one of you. It's horrifying. And listen, you don't have to write comments for everything. Sometimes names are enough because names help give purpose and intent to the code instead of having to write a comment explaining why you're doing things. So what I like to do, instead of writing these big callback functions directly on this, I like to write them up here. So I'm going to say something like const replay notes. And now this is going to be my function. And I'm going to say played notes dot map. For each note, what I want to do is I want to say window dot set timeout, which allows me to give it a callback function, which will do something. And in this case, new audio note dot file dot play. And then I can specify when I want this to happen. I want this to happen at half a second. It's going to be 500 milliseconds times the index. So the playing of each note is going to be delayed by an additional half a second. Now I have this nice name, replay notes, and instead of having all this garbage down here, I can say when we click on this replay button, I want it to replay my notes. Now this one, pretty simple. We could leave it here, but there's no harm if you wanted to keep things consistent to do something like this. And the advantage of this is if we need to change how these notes are represented, if we need to change our state model, if maybe we move this state somewhere else, maybe we do some redux things, we're much less concerned about this part, right? This presentational part. The part where we make things look the way that they do and we put them onto our page. Instead, we have all our functional stuff up here. Helps us isolate and keep track of our changes. Nice. That works. In this same vein, something I really, really, really don't like doing, I very much dislike giving a set state function, in this case set played notes, as a prop to anything. I really hate it because what can this note button do, right? We know what it does. We know that it plays a note, and it also happens to add the note that was played to our list of played notes. But if I'm just looking right here without finding where note button is defined, what can this do? Well, it can do everything. It can do anything. It can completely change the value of set played notes. Via set played notes, it can completely change the value of played notes to whatever it wants. It can clear it, it can add a note to the end, it can add a note to the beginning, right? It can make it the number 2. We can do whatever we want with that set played notes function, and that gives me great anxiety as a developer because I no longer know what note button does from this interface. Instead, I have to go read the contents of note button to find out what it does. But also, I've lost out on my names, right? I don't have a name telling me what this note button is going to do. If I come up here, right, big on click function, right, doesn't tell me very much. So what I like to do, instead of ever giving out this set played notes function, what I like to do is I like to make my little function up here. So this is going to be add played note, and it is going to take a note as an argument, and then it's going to do what we had up here. right? I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. So we can get rid of props.setPlayedNotes because we just have setPlayedNotes up here. We can get rid of props.playedNotes for the same reason. And we're making use of this note that we're getting as an argument instead of props.note. So now I can come here and I can change this to be addPlayedNote and addPlayedNote. And now, instead of this inscrutable line of code, I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to say props.addPlayedNote and give it my props.note. So what have I accomplished here? Well, a couple things. One is that I've got a good name, right? Tells me what this button's going to do. Two, I've reduced the ability for this button to do things, right? Bugs happen partially because our code can do too much. And because it can do too much, it does do too much. And a lot of what our code can do is wrong. In fact, if I were to draw a circle of things our code can do and things our code could do, right, it's very small. I'm sorry, should do. It's very small in relation to what it could do. So I like to try to take that could, I like to try to make it as small as I can, right? If all note button is allowed to do is add a played note, the worst it can really do is forget to do that or do it too many times, as opposed to changing played notes to the number 2, right? That would be very bad. We've reduced the number of things our code can do. We've gotten a good name, and another thing, we no longer need to give this played notes prop to note button. If we look up here, we never actually say props.playedNotes now. We use that just because we needed it to add values onto the end of it. So we don't have to do that anymore. So we've reduced the number of props we've needed. By simply moving the definition of our function up, we've done all of these very, very nice things to our code. We've also made this simpler, right? But one of the most important things is the idea of whose responsibility it is to do stuff. When I write React components, I like to make them dumb. A dumb component is a good component. A dumb component is a component that knows the least it possibly can about the world around it. Right? The dumbest component possible is a div or a span or something that just takes some text and it puts it on the screen. Right? It's very dumb. This note button, it's not so dumb, right? It does a lot of stuff. However, this is a much smarter component, right? When I click on this button, it calls props.setPlayedNotes and it adds a note to the end of the played notes array, right? That's pretty smart. This button has to know what setPlayedNotes is, it has to know what props.playedNotes is, and it has to know how to add things to the end of this array. It also has to guarantee, right, that this played notes is an array instead of an object or something else, right? This button is very, very smart. It has to know about a lot of things. This button is less smart. It's dumber. All it knows is that it has this function called addPlayedNote. I'm supposed to give it my note. This function will take care of the rest. Right? We've made this button dumber. And in doing so, we have freed ourselves. We've freed ourselves from bugs. We've freed ourselves from having to figure out what things do. But we've also moved complexity out of this reusable component because we might want to use this in another context. You know what? Maybe we don't want some buttons to remember the played note. And so I can just write a function that doesn't actually do anything, right? The button doesn't know the difference, right? Maybe instead I actually just want to console log the note here. And maybe we change this name so it's not add played note. It's just, on play. Right? We create this nice abstract interface just like we have on clicks. We've made note button really dumb. And the dumber our components, the more extensible, the easier to use they are, less likely we are to have bugs. So make your components dumb. All right. So that was most of the things that I wanted to cover. I want to thank all of you that stuck with me through this, even though I know you're a bit further along in your React experience, but I hope you got something out of this. At the very least, some of our neat CSS tricks. Do we have any questions about stuff before we wrap it up here? All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I will post the code for this and the YouTube recording in the channel, and I will see you all next Monday.